五旬节到了，门徒都聚集在一处。忽然，空天上有响声下来，好像一阵的风吹过，充满了他们所做的石子，又有舌头如火焰显现出来，放开落在他们个人头上。
Ils furent tous remplis du Saint-Esprit et se mirent à parler en d'autres langues, selon ce que l'Esprit leur donnait d'exprimer. À Jérusalem vivaient des Juifs, hommes pieux venus de tous les pays du monde. Quand ce bruit se fit entendre, ils s'assemblèrent en foule. Ils étaient tous profondément surpris, car chacun d'eux entendait les croyants parler dans sa propre langue.
Ilnes galu, wow, usulu, weshmeshi gahadu li kitkilamu min iljalil, ewa, kefesh ki samahum, kul wahed baluga bladu, li tolad fiha, ra feona li min blad, fartiya umadi uailem, uli ki saknu fablad mabin ilnaharin, wafalahudia, Wakabedukia, Wabintus u Asia.
Phrygien und Pamphylien, Ägypten und der Gegend von Kyrene in Libyen und Römer, die bei uns wohnen, Juden und Prolestyten, Kreter und Araber, wir hören sie in unseren Sprachen die großen Taten Gottes verkünden.
Desconcertados y perplejos se preguntaban, ¿qué quiere decir esto? Otros se burlaban y decían, lo que pasa es que están borrachos.
When the day of Pentecost had come, they were all together in one place, and suddenly from heaven there came a sound like a rush of violent wind, and there filled the entire house where they were sitting. Divided tongues as of fire appeared among them, and a tongue rested on each of them.
All of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other languages as the Spirit gave them ability. Now there were devout Jews from every nation under heaven living in Jerusalem. And at this sound the crowd gathered and was bewildered, because each one heard them speaking in the native language of each.
Amazed and astonished, they asked, "Are not all these who are speaking Galileans? And how is it that we hear, each of us, in our own native language? Parthians, Medes, Elamites, and residents of Mesopotamia, Judea, and Cappadocia, Pontus, and Asia.
Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt, and the parts of Libya belonging to Cyrene, and the visitors from Rome, both Jews and proselytes. Cretans and Arabs, in our own languages, we hear them speaking about God's deeds of power."
All were amazed and perplexed, saying to one another, "What does this mean?" But others sneered and said, "They are filled with new wine." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
This is the question parents dread the most. If life had a soundtrack, this question would be preceded by the ominous tune of some horror movie, or maybe the tune that comes from Jaws, something like that. And immediately after the question is asked, there would be some sort of hair-raising shriek off in the distance. It's that bad. I've seen parents choke on their food, and I've seen them take their child into another room before they dared to answer this question. The question is, Mom, Dad, where do babies come from? Recently, I stumbled upon a comedic Huffington Post video which said that dads in particular had 11 different options when they are forced to answer that question. There is the runner dad, who simply Forrest Gump-like just takes off running out of the house, down the street, and doesn't ever come back. Just run off, never stop. There is the ask your mother dad, who simply deflects the question to the spouse. And there is the awkward stall and just hope they forget dad. This is the dad who just sits there and stares and says, until the child loses interest and goes somewhere else to play. The article highlights 8 other potential ways in which a dad could answer that question, none of which include my favorite option. I call it the pastor option, which is God. Where do babies come from? God. Of course, there are different levels of explaining this question according to the age of the child. You can explain it in a number of ways. And then there is the answer that Mary received at the beginning of the Gospel of Luke. Did you hear it earlier in our service today? There Mary was lying on her bed in her bedroom in her parents' house, quaint little house in Nazareth, earphones over her ears, when suddenly there was a knock at the door. She barely heard it. She walked to the front door of this little house and she opened it, and there was Gabriel the angel. "Greetings, favored one, the Lord is with you," Gabriel said. "Don't be afraid, Mary. You will conceive in your womb and you will bear a child, and you shall name him Jesus." Mary said, "How can this be, since I'm a virgin? This doesn't make any sense." Which is her way of asking, where does this baby come from? And Gabriel responded to her, "The Holy Spirit will come upon you, and the power of the Most High will overshadow you." Oh, okay. And the angel Gabriel said, "If you need some evidence, consider your old Aunt Elizabeth. She's old, she's past the age of childbearing, and yet, she is in her 6th month." And Mary said, "Oh, okay, I'll give her a call." And Gabriel stood up to walk out the door, but before he left, he turned and he said, "Oh, one more thing, Mary. One more thing. Nothing is impossible with God." And that is where that baby came from. That's the explanation Mary received. The Holy Spirit will come upon you, and the power of the Most High will overshadow you. Spirit and power, power and spirit. That's how the Gospel of Luke begins. That's how the story of Jesus begins. Spirit and power, power and spirit. It wasn't someone's good idea. It wasn't a majority vote. It wasn't about human ingenuity. It was the Spirit of God. That's where babies come from. Spirit and power, power and spirit. Today is Pentecost, the third holiest day in the Christian calendar. But you wouldn't know it. It seems like a distant third. I mean, Easter and Christmas each have their own pageantry and their pomp. But most people don't even recognize today as a special Sunday at all. I'm sure somewhere a church is engaging in a chant, "We've got Spirit." Yes, we do. We've got Spirit. How about you? I'm sure there's a church out there somewhere singing happy birthday to itself. But most people just ignore the day altogether. They don't know what it's about. Maybe that shouldn't surprise us. The first Pentecost began inconspicuously enough. The disciples were there, gathered in Jerusalem. They were there because Jesus had told them to wait, and what they were waiting on was power. I find that ironic. At the end of the Gospel of Luke and the beginning of the book of Acts, as Jesus is ascending to the heavens, Jesus does not tell His people, "Now go get to work. You got to make this for yourself." That's not what He says. Jesus says, "Wait. Wait. Wait until you receive power." And so the disciples were waiting in Jerusalem, and it just so happened to be Pentecost, which before it was a Christian holiday, was a Jewish holiday. It was a day in which they celebrated the festival, or the harvest of the barley and the wheat, grand festival there. It happened 50 days after Pentecost, or 50 days after Passover, hence the name Pentecost. It was a time for Thanksgiving, harvest. Therefore, Jews from all the world over had gathered in Jerusalem. From Media to Mesopotamia, from Phrygia and Pamphylia, all the way from Egypt, they had gathered in Jerusalem. A large, diverse, global group there were in the city, gathered in that one place, when suddenly something mysterious and inexplicable happened. You get the feeling that Luke is trying, but he's having a hard time putting it into words. There was a violent wind which sounded like a rushing wind from heaven. And there appeared something like tongues of fire descending from the heavens and resting on people's heads. Violent wind and flaming tongues. And they were all filled with the Spirit, so that each person began speaking or hearing in their own native tongue. Did you hear that? Did you hear the way the story goes? It doesn't say that each person heard the same language. That's not what Pentecost is about. It says that each person heard in their own language. It wasn't conformity to one language. It was something that was so true, so deeply true, that each person could hear it in their own mother tongue. And the crowd was astonished and marveled by these Galilean fishermen. Third grade educations, no formal training. Here they are speaking the languages of the world. What does this mean? The people asked. Some bearded man over in the corner said, "Oh, they're just drunk. That's all it is." But it was about that time that Peter stood up to preach. You remember him, don't you, Peter? He had proven to be a C- disciple. He had failed more than he had succeeded. But on this day, Peter stood up and preached to the people, and he said that this inexplicable reality was the result of the Spirit in their midst. In fact, Peter said that the prophet of old, Amos, had foretold this day, when the Spirit of God would fall upon all people, and by all, Amos meant all. That sons and daughters would prophesy, which is the old way of saying preach. Did you hear that? Sons and daughters will preach. Young folks will see visions, Amos said, and old men will dream dreams. When was the last time you met an old man who was dreaming dreams? Even the bondslaves of the day, Amos says, will receive the Spirit. The down and out, the oppressed, they will receive the Spirit too. The Spirit will fall upon all people, and all people who call upon the name of the Lord will be saved. And that was the day the church was born. Where do churches come from? That's not an altogether different question than where do babies come from? You might answer that question in different ways, depending on who's doing the asking. How would you go about answering that question? Where do churches come from? They're the strangest of places. I work in one. I can tell you, churches are made of the strangest, most peculiar people you will ever meet, oftentimes doing things that don't compute. How would you answer that question? Where do churches come from? Some people would say the church is an organization, pretty much like every other organization that we know of. Churches are the ideas of the people who founded them. And at one level, that is true. Churches are indeed organizations. They have budgets and buildings and bylaws and committees and business meetings. Oh my. And even the churches that snicker at the institutionalization of other churches themselves have some degree of institutionalization and organization. It's true that someone, somewhere, had the idea to start pretty much every church you will ever walk into. And we are here today largely because 11 people decided to begin worshiping at this location in 1884. And they developed a constitution and bylaws and that sort of stuff. Some people would say that's the church. It's an organization just like every other organization. A rotary with a steeple, that sort of thing. And some would say the church is like a big family. And that's true to a certain extent too. Because people in church share life together over the span of time. We know each other. We know each other's strengths. And we know each other's, not so much strengths, that kind of stuff. We tend to function together like families do, with all the dysfunction and pathology therein. We have patriarchs and matriarchs in churches just like families do. We have black sheep just like families do. We have immature members who think they're heard because they shout the loudest, just like families do. And we have mature members who are heard because they speak the truth, just like families do. We have over-functioning members who do too much and under-functioning members who do too little, just like families. And so some people think of the church as a big, giant family. Only this one you actually choose to enter into, which has some degree of crazy in that decision. And some people see the church as nothing more than the creation of those who lead it. The church is measured by the charisma of the pastor or the charisma of the staff, the gifts of the staff. The church is just a platform for its leaders who sell their goods and religious services, that sort of stuff. These are some of the explanations, but none of these are the explanation. If you look at the baby pictures of the church, these are not what you will see. They were meeting in a house. They were waiting on some power. They did not have a church building. They did not have a pastor. They did not have any ordained clergy at all, for that matter. The man who was given the mic wasn't exactly a paragon of virtue or an exemplar of the faith or a saint by any measure. They did not have a budget. They did not have committees. Heck, they did not have a sign or a steeple. They didn't even have a copy machine. And they were hardly a family. Most of the people who gathered that day had never seen each other before. They were from Media to Mesopotamia and Phrygia and Pamphylia to Egypt. They were from all over the world. It was a crowd similar to what you would expect at Riverfest if you went down there late last night, and I know you did. On that day, on the day the church was born, it was born of something more mysterious, something more powerful. It wasn't the sort of thing that could be measured by the metrics of business and science. It was the sort of thing that can only be explained with something like a wild wind and flaming tongues. The day the church was born, it was an act of the Spirit of God. Spirit and power, power and spirit. And if you hang around the church long enough, warts and dysfunction and all, if you hang around the church long enough, you're apt to bump it into this mystery and this power. Look around this room today, would you? Go ahead and look around. Most of the time, when large groups like this gather, I can explain why they're in the same room. They have some sort of shared affinity, or some sort of demographic similarity, or some sort of action item that brings them all together. But this room is about as diverse a group of people as you're going to find anywhere in Little Rock anytime soon. Name the spectrum, and it is crossed to some degree just within the walls of this room. I think I see people who came from a long way away. I think I saw earlier some Pamphylians and Phrygians in the back of the room. I think I saw some people from Mesopotamia and Media and Egypt, Arkansas, of course. Somehow, some way, we are able to get one another. Somehow, some way, we are able to understand one another and speak each other's language, heart to heart, soul to soul, and it is nothing less than a miracle of God. The only thing that binds us together is Jesus. And yet, in some strange way that I cannot explain, that one thing that binds us is stronger than the millions of forces that would pull us apart. It's a miracle. There's something powerful in that. Last year, I was standing around one night after VBS, and a mother came to pick up her child. The music was loud. I was standing in the back of the room. One of our volunteers was standing in the back of the room, and this mother came in and came to the back of the room. She leaned to our volunteer and she said, "Which one is your child?" Our volunteer said, "Oh, I don't have any children." And the mother was shocked. She said, "You're working VBS and you don't have a child in this room? Bless your soul," the mother said. I could see her wheels turning. She was thinking, I have to take care of my children. And here's someone who volunteers to take care of someone else's. Do you see how strange the church is? It's a strange place. The church is the place where we take care of other people's children as if they were our own. And sometimes would say they are. Strange place. A few years ago in my former church, I was sitting in my office one day when the phone rang. Hello. The voice on the other end of the line said, "Are you the pastor?" I said, "Yes." And this young woman said, "What's your church's dress code?" I said, "Oh, we don't have a dress code." And she said, "Are you sure? I just came out of a church in which our first Sunday there, they gave my daughter a printout of the dress code. I need to know if you have a dress code." I said, "We don't have a dress code." She said, "Are you the boss of the church? Is there someone higher up I need to ask?" I said, "Look, we don't have a dress code." She said, "Okay, I might see you on Sunday." I said, "Okay." She said, "One more question, but don't hang up, one more question." She said, "Is it okay if I like rock music?" I said, "The good kind or the bad kind?" There's some music that is a sin to listen to. She said, "I love Jesus, but I love rock music too. And if I have to choose between Jesus and rock music, I don't know." I said, "We'll see you on Sunday." The next Sunday, Mindy Allen came to church with her 2 children, the oldest of which was born when she was 15 years old. She came to church with not 1 ounce of pretense or religiosity. If you asked a question, she didn't know the answer, but that never prevented her from answering. She was a breath of fresh air. I remember the day she was baptized. I remember vividly, before she was baptized, she came up to the pulpit and she said to that church, "I moved to Oklahoma City from Florida, and I didn't know one person in this city. I needed help. I needed love. I needed people. I needed a place to belong." She said, "This church welcomed me. This church loved me. This church showed me what God was really like." She said, "This church saved my life." She said, "I don't mean save my soul." She said, "I don't know what a soul is. This church saved my life." And we baptized her. Most people, including me, do not think of the church as saving people's lives. But I do know this. Wherever the Spirit is, there is power. The Spirit showed up in Jerusalem that day in a small church. They fit in a house, a small house. And there amongst a group that had no building and no budget and no minister and no steeple and no copier, the wind blew and the fire fell. And those diverse people came together and they went out from there and changed the world. They spoke truth to power. They welcomed anyone Jesus welcomed. They formed communities that transcended all sorts of boundaries. They were arrested. They marched in picket lines. They wrote hymns and poems. They loved in a strange, peculiar, inexplicable way. And they turned the world upside down. One of my favorite preachers, Barbara Brown Taylor, says we shouldn't think of the church being blown by the Spirit of God out into the world. Pentecost was like God sneezing. God sneezed the world, sneezed the church out into the world. Y'all, I, like you, can explain the church in a number of ways. Organizationally, sociologically, anthropologically, I can define the church in all of those ways. But none of those can account for the mystery and the wonder and the power. I guess you could say what Luke is saying, that the church's story began the same way Jesus' story began. The Holy Spirit came upon them, and the power of the Most High overshadowed them. The church's birth was a virgin birth too. And when the church took its first breath, it breathed in the same thing Jesus breathed in when He took His first breath. I see all the problems. I see most of the problems. A lot of times it's me. I see a lot of failure in the church. I see a lot of cynicism about the church. But every now and then, I bump into power. Don't go saying it's impossible. Please, please, don't say it's impossible. Because with God, all things are possible. Spirit and power. Power and Spirit.